The photograph was first noticed for what it lacked. May 3rd, 1886, a quiet afternoon inside the drawing room of Winthrope House, just outside the town border of Vermont, Vermont. The tall windows let in a clean spill of sunlight, touching the deep green carpets and illuminating the ornate furniture with a warm, pale glow. In that moment, the room was perfectly still. A large mahogany chair stood in the center, flanked by two smaller ones. Seated upon them, almost unnaturally composed, were Elisha Winthrope, his wife Clara, and their teenage son, Malcolm. The photographer, Alton Red, hunched behind his boxy camera, a thick black cloth draped over his head like a priest's shroud. He had already prepared the collodion plate, counting silently under his breath as the seconds passed. 11, he whispered, then pulled the shutter closed with a precise, practiced motion. His breath caught briefly. Something about the light had shimmered just then, unnaturally sharp against the back wall, but he chalked it up to glare and blinked it away. He stood. "That should do," Red muttered, lifting the cloth and nodding toward the family. "You may relax now." Elisha didn't respond immediately. He remained in his posture, hands folded, eyes just off-center from the lens. Clara exhaled softly and shifted in her seat. Malcolm glanced toward the fireplace, his expression unreadable, then looked back to Red. "Are you quite finished, sir?" Elisha finally asked, his voice low, firm. "Yes, sir," Red said, stepping away from the camera. "Plate's clean." Sunlight held steady. "Should be a sharp image." Elisha nodded once. "Then we'll leave you to it." They stood in quiet unison and left the room without another word. Red packed his equipment in silence, but his hand hesitated over the glass plate. It had developed strange texture along the surface, a faint swirling near the bottom edge. He leaned in closer but thought better of it. He'd check it again in the dark room. Nearly a century later, in 1972, that very plate, along with its duplicate, resurfaced in a locked walnut case, deep within a filing cabinet at the Braylock Historical Society. A restoration archivist named Adrian Kell had been sorting through decades of neglected archives when he pulled the case free. The wood was dry and cracking, its hinges stained dark with rust. But inside, wrapped in yellowing velvet, the glass negatives were pristine. Kell knew what he was looking at. Two nearly identical photographs. Same angle, same room, same family, same exposure note. May 3rd, 1886. Winthrope House, 11 seconds. At first glance, everything aligned. The family's poses matched exactly, as though nothing had changed between the first and second exposure. But something had. Kell tilted his head, frowning. "Where's the shadow?" he murmured. In the first plate, the sunlight filtered in clearly, casting long, detailed shadows of the three figures across the rug. Elisha's shadow stretched back, defined and heavy. Clara's curved toward the fireplace. Malcolm's landed neatly along the trim of the window behind him. But in the second plate, taken mere seconds later, the shadows were simply gone. Kell leaned in closer. Not faded, not lighter, gone. He fetched a magnifying loupe, adjusted the light, and scanned the edges. Nothing. The silhouettes had been lifted clean off the image as though the light had passed through their bodies untouched. When he reported the anomaly to his supervisor, the plates were immediately pulled for analysis. Over the next 6 months, photographic experts from across New England examined the negatives. They tested for overexposure, double layering, emulsion degradation. They even suspected deliberate tampering, a hoax perhaps. But no technique they knew could explain what the plates revealed in sequence. One figure's shadow, Malcolm's, vanished completely by the second plate. Clara's blurred as if reaching toward the stone fireplace, and Elisha's moved forward, unnatural, toward the lens itself. Not bent like a cast shadow should be, but upright, vertical, as though standing behind the camera and peering in. Could someone have stood behind the lens during exposure? One technician asked. "Not without casting a reflection," another replied, "and not without being in the image." The negatives were clean, undamaged, unaltered. A week later, Kell returned to the drawing room at Winthrope House, now shuttered and used only for seasonal tours. He stood where the family had once sat, watching the light pour in through the same old windows. Dust hovered in the beams like suspended ash. He looked down. His own shadow, cast across the floor, stretched long and crisp. Then he blinked. Something else had moved, a flutter in the edge of vision. He turned sharply toward the fireplace. Nothing. Only silence and the faint ticking of a clock that hadn't worked in decades. He left quickly after that. Over time, others examined the photographs. Each time, a different detail stood out. The way Clara's fingers curled subtly between plates, the slight narrowing of Elisha's gaze, the faint blur above Malcolm's chair, like heat rising from stone. But the shadows. Always the shadows. The room stayed still. The people sat motionless. Yet their shadows behaved with will of their own. In a late interview with the Braylock Journal, Kell said something he never repeated elsewhere. "They sat perfectly still," he whispered, "but something in the room did not." It began with the scorched shutter. Alton Red, a photographer of modest reputation, stepped into his studio one morning in late April of 1888 to find the chemical scent of ruin hanging thick in the air. The shutters had not merely been jammed, they were blackened, twisted at the gears, the brass warped like wax under flame. The camera housing remained untouched, still bolted to the oak tripod, its brass fittings cool to the touch. But the shutter, the very eye of his craft, was ruined from within, as if it had looked at something too long and had been punished for it. Red backed away slowly. His boots crunched on shards of cracked glass negatives strewn across the floor, plates he could not recall placing there. Behind the curtain, half-developed images hung limp in the drying rack. Most were fogged, overexposed. One, however, was distinct. 3 seated figures. A man, a woman, a child. The Winthropes. He hadn't thought of them in months. They had come in early May of 1886, requesting a portrait for reasons Elisha Winthrope did not disclose. "It's simply time," the man had said, removing his gloves with slow, deliberate care. His wife, Clara, had said nothing. She held their boy, Malcolm, perhaps 9, close to her side, even as he coughed quietly into his sleeve. Red remembered the boy's skin had been pale, his gaze unfocused, but he sat still when asked. All 3 of them did. Afternoon, fair light, no movement, exposure 11 seconds, Red had noted neatly in his ledger. He recalled how, as the light spilled through the long windows of the drawing room at Winthrope House, the family did not blink. They did not shift. Even the child, lips cracked and eyes blinking slowly, had not moved once. It was a perfect session. And yet, Red had felt a peculiar pressure in the room, as if the light were thickening, coiling into corners where it didn't belong. The negatives were supposed to be delivered within 2 weeks. But Red, consumed by other work and vaguely unsettled by how the plates had developed, shadows misaligned, strange light artifacts, had shelved them in the back of his cabinet and told himself he'd call upon the family once the final varnish cured. He never did. And now, in April of 1888, standing amid the ruins of his studio and the silent witnesses of ruined images, Red thought of Winthrope House again. He wrapped the surviving negatives, the Winthrope plates, and placed them gently in a leather satchel. He made no entries in his ledger. That night, without notifying his landlord, without informing the local merchants' guild, Alton Red locked the studio door, mailed a single letter to his cousin in Albany, and vanished from Claremont. The building stood vacant for 3 months. Reverend Thaddeus Earlham, who presided over St. Winifred's parish, had long been suspicious of the Winthropes. In his leather-bound register he had once penned, "Mr. Winthrope's absence from Sunday attendance stretches into weeks. The child, frail. The wife, withdrawn. their windows always curtained. It was Reverend Earlham who walked past Winthrope House one mist-heavy morning in June, hat pulled low, coat damp at the cuffs. The path leading to the house was overgrown, the gate unlatched, swaying slightly though there was no wind. He approached out of pastoral duty, out of a quiet, gnawing concern that something had gone wrong. He knocked. He waited. Nothing. He knocked again, louder. No echo returned. No shifting inside. No reply. He circled the house, peering in through the side parlor window, its sheer curtain slightly parted. Dust clung to the inside glass, but he could just make out the drawing room. 3 chairs neatly arranged, the same ones Red would later confirm from his photograph. They looked recently used, but there were no frames on the mantel, no books on the table, no fire laid in the hearth. He pressed his palm to the glass. Cold, not from the weather, from within. Later that week, Earlham returned with the town constable. They knocked, called out, then pried the door gently with the back of a chisel. It gave way easily. The house was silent. Room by room, they searched. No signs of violence, no signs of theft, no signs of anything. Human. Clothing remained in wardrobes. Silver remained in drawers. But the beds were stripped, the pantry bare. In Malcolm's room, a rocking horse stood mid-motion, its bristles worn, its saddle faded. No recent footprints marked the wooden floor. No notes were left. No animals stirred in the stables. It was as though the Winthropes had simply gotten up and walked out of the world. That same evening, Reverend Earlham sat at his study desk, hands clasped over the parish register. He opened the leather-bound book, dipped his pen, and wrote in deliberate, sober strokes. The house of Winthrope appears closed. No word, no mourning. He hesitated, then added beneath it, and no one ever answered the door again at Winthrope House. The lab light buzzed faintly overhead as Professor Gilbert Frine slid the 3rd glass plate onto the stage of the polarized mercury vapor viewer. His hands, gloved and steady despite the tremor of age, adjusted the bracket arms until the plate clicked into place. He leaned forward, peering through the mounted loop with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime with shadows and silver. He didn't speak for several moments. His breath fogged slightly on the chilled metal frame, the lens cool against his brow. The faint hum of the preservation chamber behind him formed a steady backdrop, comforting, mechanical, unchanging. But what he saw beneath the lens was not. 3 sitters, he murmured at last, his voice low, uncertain. But only 2 shadows. He drew back slowly, blinking in disbelief, then turned toward the assistant hovering near the side table. Lyle. Mark this. Plate 3, the anomalies present. Lyle Drecker, a graduate fellow at the fictional Eldridge Institute of Photographic Science, stepped forward with a clipboard in hand. He paused just before reaching the table, frowning. Which one's missing? Elisha Winthrope, Frayne said, barely above a whisper. His body's there, but the shadow isn't. They stared together at the glowing image projected through the glass. Father, mother, son, all seated upright with the precise symmetry expected in a Victorian family portrait. Clara's dress flared neatly to the side, Malcolm's hands were folded in his lap, and Elisha's shoes were placed firmly on the ornate rug. But behind them, only 2 defined stretches of shade. Elisha, somehow, cast nothing. Could it be a development flaw? Lyle asked cautiously. Silver halide bleed? Shadow displacement due to reflector error? Frayne shook his head. No, there's consistency in the edge dispersion. Angle of incidence is identical across the exposure. You can't remove a shadow without removing the object. He tapped the brass-rimmed frame of the viewer, eyes narrowing. And yet, here, the object remains. For hours they rechecked everything. Exposure time, chemical composition, humidity levels, even the lens curvature of the 1880s Braylock plates. Nothing explained the absence. The emulsion layer showed no signs of stress. There was no double exposure, no solarization, no damage from handling, and, most disturbing of all, the sun had been high and strong that day, May 3, 1886, confirmed by historical weather charts from the Burlington Archive. "I want to see Plate 4, Frayne said finally, straightening with a sigh. His back ached, but curiosity pushed him forward. Lyle brought the next negative over with cautious reverence. The fourth plate was slightly darker in contrast, but still intact. As it illuminated beneath the vapor light, both men leaned in, holding their breath. The third shadow, Elisha's, had returned, but it no longer rested at his feet. Instead, it had migrated. Tilted sharply across the floor, it now stretched behind the camera position, upward at an impossible angle toward the ceiling, far removed from the direction of natural sunlight. Frayne's breath caught in his throat. That's not a refraction. That's movement. The hair on Lyle's arms prickled as he stepped back. Wait, that's behind the lens. That's not where it should be. Frayne remained still, his face pale. It's not just moved. It's looking back. He turned abruptly and crossed the room, lifting a thin folder from a shelf of prepared notes. Inside was a detailed map of the Winthrope House's drawing room, the very room in which the photo had been taken. The sun had entered from the east-facing window just behind the photographer's position. Shadows should have been short, pointing west. None of this added up. Let me check something, Frayne muttered, flipping through a weather log. Yes, 2:17 p.m. Full sun, no cloud cover. Light from the southeast. There should be no shadows near the camera, let alone above it. Lyle returned to the viewer, squinting again at the fourth plate. Professor, look at the corner by the fireplace. That rug, those black streaks, is that burning? They both leaned in. Just beyond the chair legs, beneath where the missing shadows had once lain, were faint, near-symmetrical dark markings. Not soot, not grime. Burn marks. Frayne ordered the lab lights lowered and passed a cold probe over the plate. There was no residue, but the image was clear. The floorboards showed a radial scorch, as if something had seared the air but left the wood intact. And then came the entry in the old diary. The fragment came from a faded leather-bound journal sold in a lot at Hollow Glen Auction House. Its owner, a man named Henry Culliver, had lived next door to the Winthropes during the 1880s. Most of the pages contained mundane notes about garden pests, weather complaints, and town gossip. But on May 4th, the day after the portrait was taken, he'd written just one line. I never liked how the light behaved around that house. Frayne read the sentence aloud, eyes fixed on the page. Not how the house looked. Not the Winthropes themselves. The light. He set the diary down slowly, his gaze drifting back to the two plates, one with a missing shadow, the other with a shadow defying every law of physics and angle. Could it be? Lyle started, then trailed off. Frayne raised a hand to silence him. He moved to the window, pulling aside the blackout curtain just enough to let a shaft of afternoon sunlight streak across the desk. He placed a ruler and his own hand in its path. A perfect shadow formed on the polished oak surface, crisp, expected, obedient to nature. He looked again at the images on the viewer. The house obeyed gravity, he said, voice low, hollow, but the shadows did not. The photograph didn't move, but the shadows did. Inside the controlled lab of the New Haven Museum of Image and Light, under a canopy of humming fluorescence and the faint scent of acetate. Doctor. Evelyn Quarles leaned closer to the negative plate resting under the polarized mercury vapor beam. Her brow tightened. What she was seeing contradicted every principle she'd taught over 20 years of photographic conservation. The shadows, if that's what they still were, extended just beyond the emulsion's edge, creeping into blank glass where no image should exist. There was no physical medium to carry them, no chemical explanation, no light spill or leakage. Yet there they were, faint, grainy tendrils like smoke trailing off the frame. She gestured for her assistant. "Walter," she said quietly, "get a spectro read." Right along the bleed, Walter Lynn, a thin-framed technician with prematurely white hair, moved carefully to her side, adjusting the sensor over the ghosted edge of the plate. The monitor pulsed as data streamed across its surface, trace levels of silver nitrate, but no emulsion, no base, just residual presence. "That's impossible," he muttered, voice brittle. "There's no substrate to hold the image." "And yet it's holding something," Quarles replied, her voice calm but taut with curiosity. They ran the test again, and again. Every time, the machine confirmed the anomaly, a photographic signature existing in chemical absence. Quarles stepped back from the station, her hands slightly trembling, though she would never admit it aloud. To verify, she ordered a recreation, strict controls, same parameters. They used wet plate collodion, red's exact lens length, mirrors arranged to simulate the sunlight angle from May 3, 1886. Everything documented in the Braylock notes. The staging room was carefully prepared, even the chair placements and window treatments replicated down to the grain. A portrait was taken. 3 male museum staff posing in identical posture. Faces still, exposure precisely 11 seconds. As the plate developed in the darkroom's amber glow, Walter watched the liquid rise like fog over glass. Lines emerged, the window, the figures, their crisp outlines, and then something absent. "There are no shadows," he whispered. Quarles stepped in, examined the plate. "None." He shook his head. "Not faint. Just gone." They repeated the session twice more. Different angles, different plates, always the same. Bodies captured, background consistent, but no shadows. By the third session, Walter looked pale. He leaned against the counter, steadying himself. "You all right?" Quarles asked, eyes narrowing. "It's nothing. Just, during the last shot, I thought I heard something, like dry leaves scraping stone. It was faint, but close. In here?" "No. In the viewfinder." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Like something was just behind me." Quarles stared at him, her mouth forming a reply she never spoke. Instead, she turned to the corner mantel where a restored 1880s Aveline clock sat ticking. One of her team had loaned it for atmospheric authenticity. Her eyes narrowed. "Walter, did we stop the clock before the session?" He glanced over. "We did." "I wound it, but left the arm at noon." "Why?" The second hand now ticked softly, pointing at 2:02. She walked over and touched the glass. Cold. Not warm as expected from a wound spring mechanism running for over 2 minutes. The air around it had a strange density, like the heaviness before thunder. That evening, once the prints dried, they studied them under magnification. The images showed the seated staff, clearly lit, but no shadows beneath their feet or cast against the back wall. And one detail more. In the final print, the center subject, Harold Mann, the museum's junior conservator, had blinked. It was clear in the still. Both eyelids half closed, mid-blink, but all 3 men had sworn they hadn't moved, even slightly. Quarles double-checked the exposure log. 11 seconds. Not one more. No movement. No shutter delay, she said. Yet the image said otherwise. She studied Harold's face. The corners of his mouth appeared tense, not blurred, but shifted, as if reacting to something unseen at the moment of capture. And behind him, just at the edge of the chair leg, a faint blur. Not an object, not a camera shake, but a distortion, as if a patch of air had been pulled forward and smeared into shape. She closed the file with a slow, deliberate motion, her voice barely above a breath. And one figure in the image blinked. The first time Professor Linford Chase saw the negatives under magnification, he didn't speak for 20 minutes. The room was silent, but for the slow tick of a brass pendulum clock behind him. He adjusted the microscope's focus with trembling fingers, his breath fogging the chilled surface of the viewing lens. The Winthrope plates had been sent to him from Braylock for peer analysis, routine, they said. Nothing unusual, but Chase had been teaching chemical image processes for 23 years, and what he saw contradicted every natural principle he understood. In Plate 3, he found two shadows, long and angular, unmistakably cast by the seated father and mother. But in Plate 4, taken mere seconds later, Elisha Winthrope's shadow had moved, not merely faded or shifted with light, but had repositioned entirely to behind the camera, stretched like smoke toward the ceiling. And Malcolm, the boy, had none at all. Chase straightened in his chair, forehead damp. This isn't chemical failure," he whispered. His assistant, Ernest Vale, leaned closer. "Could it be halide breakdown?" Chase shook his head. "No. No bleeding, no mottling. The silver nitrate layer is clean." He flipped through his notes, then looked again. "But the spatial distortion, it's like the shadows have mass." Ernest frowned. "Mass? You mean?" "I mean," Chase replied, his voice dry, "they're behaving like subjects, not reflections." That night, Chase proposed his theory in a tightly worded letter to the Eldridge Journal of Optical Phenomena. He argued that an extremely rare halide separation could hypothetically alter shadow behavior if the emulsion responded erratically to a magnetic field. But in his private notebook, he wrote something else. "The image cannot lie. Therefore, we must lie to explain it." 3 months later, a second theory arrived, this time from a retired criminal historian named Inspector Hal Wythe. Known in New Hampshire for cracking the Ashmont widow poisonings, Wythe had studied the Winthrope files with the precision of a forensics officer. He wasn't interested in light angles or collodion emulsions. He saw deception. "This is a staged erasure," he said bluntly during a Braylock symposium. "Photographic misdirection, plain and criminal." He posited that Alton Red, the photographer, had manipulated the plates to mask a domestic murder. Perhaps the family had been dead before the shutter opened. Perhaps Red had faked the session to sell the illusion of peace. After all, no one had seen the Winthropes after that portrait date. No letters, no burials, no witnesses. But when a forensic sweep of the property was authorized in 1996, decades after abandonment, cadaver dogs found no trace of decay. Floorboards were undisturbed. No blood, no drag marks, no bodies. The house had simply waited. Wythe, undeterred, declared, "If there was no blood, then perhaps the crime was in the image itself." Still, something didn't sit right. If it had been a murder, why no confession from Red? Why the scorched shutter in his studio? And why abandon his entire business? Then came the third theory. It did not appear in peer-reviewed journals or polished reports. It surfaced in the pages of the Parallax Ledger, a fringe quarterly dedicated to temporal phenomena, speculative astronomy, and so-called thin moments. The author, credited only as MDA, claimed the portrait session on May 3, 1886, aligned with a lunar geophysical threshold, one of several brief apertures where time and matter grew permeable. According to the article, the jump in the Aveline mantle clock during the 11-second exposure was not mechanical failure, but temporal dilation. The soot-rimmed shutter, the cold scorch marks on the floorboards, the vanished child's shadow, all symptoms of a momentary perforation in chronology. Something passed through, the article stated, or something was taken. The theory was dismissed immediately by most professionals, but not all. Professor Chase, now retired, circled 2 lines in the magazine with red ink and scribbled beside them. Check angle of entry, north window. As speculation grew, the Winthrope plates became infamous in both academic and occult circles. Conferences debated them. Podcasts tried to explain them. One unsettling pattern became clear when the shadows in plates 3 and 4 were inverted. They revealed figures not matching the sitters. Elisha's shadow, in particular, now bore the outline of a man with a broad, brimmed hat, a detail impossible, as Elisha had been bald and wore no headwear during the session. Another figure, positioned slightly to the left of Clara, reached forward, palm extended, fingers long and distorted as if pressing against unseen glass. And Malcolm, the boy's silhouette, already faint in Plate 3, was gone entirely by Plate 4. No researcher could trace what happened in those 11 seconds, but they all agreed. Whatever had shifted had not shifted randomly, and somewhere beneath it all, a single haunting sentence remained in every archived report, every footnote, every whispered debate between those who dared study the case too long. And the child's shadow was never visible again. The front door splintered inward with a groan, its hinges weeping rust as the assessor's pry bar cracked the seal of time. It had been sealed for decades, untouched, unsold, and unnaturally intact despite the collapse of the surrounding estate. The morning was overcast, a pale gray light pressing through the autumn trees. Paul Rayner stepped back from the threshold, breathing through the sleeve of his jacket. Mold, rot, and something more metallic filled the air, something that clung not just to his clothes but to his skin. "Documentation begins," he said, clicking on his shoulder-mounted recorder, his voice steady but tight. "October 11th, 2003. Entry into Winthrope House authorized under Reassessment Order B-72. Interior unentered since at least 1980 by official records." Dust curled from the floor as he stepped inside. His boots sank slightly into the bloated wood planks, and each movement sent tiny echoes up through the silence. The hallway was narrow and dark. Water stains streaked down the floral wallpaper, but oddly, no vines, no intrusion of the outside world had found its way in. It was too clean, dead clean. Paul made his way to the drawing room with careful steps, guided by the dim light leaking from the covered windows. As he pushed open the door, he stopped. Something in the air shifted. A low vibration, not sound exactly, but a pressure behind his ears. 3 chairs stood facing the tall central window. Their backs were straight, their embroidered cushions sunken just enough to show where someone had once sat and never stood up. Dust settled evenly across the room, except for those outlines. No portraits on the wall, no books, no clock on the mantel. He crouched, running a gloved finger through the space where the dust gave way to absence. The shape was human, narrow, shoulder-width, and unmistakably recent in contrast. But that wasn't possible. There was no heat signature, no animal intrusion, no open path in or out. Then he saw them on the west wall. Vertical smears, almost subtle at first, like oil dragged upward, not down. Paul stepped closer. The streaks were nearly 6 feet long, evenly spaced, running from just above floor level to the height of a man. But they weren't streaks of handprints. There were no fingers, no palm shapes, just long dark pulls against the faded wallpaper. He turned off the flashlight just to see. In the silence, the room seemed to inhale. When he clicked the light back on, something had changed. The farthest chair was turned slightly toward him. Paul froze. No, that wasn't like that, he whispered. His own voice felt foreign in the space. He snapped a photo, then another. The chair remained still. Back at the Braylock Historical Society 3 days later, Paul delivered the footage, the photographs, and his notes to the archive team. Among them was digital curator Miriam Voigt's assistant, Nathan Greaves, a quiet man in his late 40s with a keen eye for image anomalies. "I'll upload the plates into the digitization batch tonight," Nathan said. "Shouldn't take long." But the file transfer took exactly 11 seconds longer than expected. Every time. Nathan checked the system's internal clock. Synced. No faults, no errors in the drive or transfer rate, but still 11 seconds of black screen before each image loaded. When the first plate finally appeared, Nathan leaned forward. The family, Elisha, Clara, and young Malcolm, were centered in frame. expressionless, proper, perfectly still. But then the screen pulsed, subtly like a heartbeat. The next second, the frame appeared to shift slightly. The chair legs no longer aligned with the fireplace in the background. The carpet's woven pattern moved off-center. Nathan blinked, pressed pause, rewound. The shift wasn't in the image, it was in the viewer. He replayed it. 11 seconds in, the photo dimmed, flickered. The room behind the family went dark. The edges of the frame warped, as though the lens had bent. Then, something truly impossible happened. Elisha's gaze moved. Just slightly. Just enough. Nathan pushed back from the screen, breath catching. He looked behind him, toward the black window outside the archive office. Just his own reflection. But when he turned back, his reflection in the screen didn't turn at the same time. He staggered to his feet. "Miriam," he called out. No answer. The next day, the team reviewed the footage together. They documented the distortion, the blackouts, the warping, the eyes moving. But each viewer described something different. One saw Clara blink. Another claimed young Malcolm had risen from the chair. Miriam herself insisted the background light dimmed to nothing, except for a figure faintly visible near the fireplace. They archived the images under restricted access. But reports started coming in from staff. Small things. Mirrors fogging without cause. Reflections lagging by a half second. A sense of movement in the corners of vision, especially near screens. One intern refused to return after reviewing the footage alone. He claimed his reflection no longer followed him home. Nathan, now visibly shaken, gave one last note in his report before requesting reassignment. The photographs are not broken. They are behaving exactly as they were meant to. We are simply not meant to watch. And over time, one phrase began to circulate around the quiet halls of Braylock, spoken in whispers and always with a glance toward the glass doors as dusk approached. And their shadows do not return at the same pace. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of the supernatural, identity, and the haunting boundaries between reality and imagination. Its purpose is to evoke curiosity, inspire wonder, and remind us of humanity's enduring fascination with what cannot be seen or explained.